If saying no to scope creep makes you sound rigid, negative, or unhelpful, the problem is usually not the no itself. It's how the no is delivered. A lot of project managers know something should not be added, changed, or expanded. But instead of responding clearly, they either soften too much, leave the door too open, or sound more resistant than they need to. So the conversation gets messy. The request is not really contained, and the project manager ends up sounding either weak or difficult. A better response is much simpler. You want three things: acknowledgement, constraint, and redirect. That is the structure. Show that you heard the request, state the project constraint clearly, and then redirect the conversation toward a workable path. If you do that well, you can say no to scope creep without sounding unhelpful. So, let's make this practical. The first part is acknowledge. This is where you show that you understand the request before you respond to it. Not because every request is good, and not because you need to agree with it, but because people usually respond better when they feel heard before the boundary appears. A useful question to ask yourself here is, what exactly is being asked? Another good question is, what is reasonable to acknowledge before I respond? That matters because a lot of project managers jump straight into resistance. They hear a change request and immediately go into protection mode. So instead of sounding controlled, they sound irritated or closed. That usually makes the discussion harder. So in this first part, your job is to acknowledge the request cleanly. That can sound like, I understand why that is being raised. Or, I see why that would be valuable. Or, that makes sense as a business ask. You're not approving the request. You are showing that you understand it. That makes the next part easier to hear. The second part is constraint. This is where you explain why the request cannot just be absorbed into the work as if it's cost nothing. And this part matters because scope creep usually becomes dangerous when the request is treated like it has no impact. A useful question to ask yourself here is, what project constraint does this affect? And another good one is, what becomes harder if we add this now? That helps because strong project management language sounds grounded in trade-offs, not emotion or frustration, but trade-offs. Does the change affect timeline, resources, testing, approvals, dependencies, priority sequencing? What is the actual constraint? That is what you need to name. So instead of saying, we can't do that, although I know you'll never say that, you can say, adding that now would affect the current timeline. Or, that would require a scope adjustment, not just a quick addition. Or, if we bring that in here, it changes the current delivery sequence. That sounds much more useful because now you're not rejecting the idea in a personal way. You're identifying the project reality. The third part is redirect. This is where you keep the conversation moving instead of ending at the no. And this part is important because a lot of project managers sound unhelpful when they stop at the boundary. They say no, but they do not give the conversation a next place to go. A good question to ask yourself here is, what is the workable path from here? Or, if we cannot do this now, what can we do instead? That keeps the discussion productive because strong scope control is not only about protecting the project, it's also about giving people a clear way to think about the request. So this part can sound something like this. We can evaluate that for the next phase. Or, if this needs to be included now, we should revisit timeline and priority. Or, let's separate that from the current deliverable and assess it as a change. These are things that can help, but also consider that lots of elements of scope creep also may include an additional cost. These statements give the no structure. It turns a rejection into project management. So, when you put the three parts together, it becomes much easier to respond well. Acknowledge, show you heard the request. Constraint, state the project reality. And redirect, show the workable next path. That is the structure, and it works because it keeps you away from two common mistakes. The first is weak openness. That is when the project manager sounds so flexible that the request starts entering the work before it has really been evaluated. The second is flat resistance. That is when the project manager says no in a way that shuts down the discussion but adds no clarity. You want the middle path, clear and useful. For example, I understand why that feature is being requested. Adding it now would affect the current delivery sequence. If this is becoming a priority, we should review it as a scope change and reset expectations accordingly. That works because the response does three things well. It acknowledges the request, it names the constraint, and it redirects the conversation toward a process. Another mistake project managers make is over-explaining the no because they want to avoid sounding difficult. So they start listing every dependency, every pressure point, every resource issue, and every reason the project is already under strain. That usually weakens the response. You do not need a long defense every time scope pressure appears. You need a clear boundary and a useful next step. Then, if people want more detail, you can provide it. That is a better rhythm. Now, this matters even more when the request comes from someone senior, because that is when many project managers start sounding overly cautious or strangely vague. They know they should not simply absorb the request, but they do not want to sound like they are blocking progress. So, the language gets softer and less clear. That is usually where scope control gets weaker, but the same structure still works. You do not need a completely different message because the title in the room is higher. You need clean language tied to project reality. For example, I understand the value of that addition. Right now, it would expand the current scope and affect delivery timing. If we want to include it, we should treat it as a scope decision and align on what moves with it. That is respectful, but it still protects the project. So, if you want a practical way to say no to scope creep without sounding unhelpful, ask yourself three questions. What am I acknowledging? What constraint does this affect? And what is the workable path from here? Then, check four things before you respond. Did I show I understood the request? Did I name the real trade-off clearly? Did I redirect instead of just blocking? And did I stop once the response was clear? That is the goal. Not a longer no, a cleaner no. Because strong project management communication is not about resisting every request. It is about containing change without letting the project drift.